There we go.
So if anybody objects to it, can't. We'll just have to go with it. Okay, welcome to the second Calumet Revisited Forum of the year. I am Michael Bowles of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative. Um, uh, um, I am co-host with Dr. Valerie Penninan, Professor Emerita of History at Calumet College. Before we hear from tonight's speaker, are there any announcements? Hearing none.
I
Um,
guess what I would like to say,
yeah,
the Northwest Indiana Civil War Roundtable will be hosting History Speaks. We may have a different title for it, but it'll be at the Buckley Homestead on June 7th, I believe from 10 to 4 or 10 to 5 that day. We're in the process of working on it, so if anybody has ideas through Mike, you can send me an email or get in touch with me.
okay, that was very nice. Anything, any other announcements? Okay, before we hear from tonight's speakers, or I would too many people are coming in. We may
There we
get
go.
we may get up to a 40. Um, I would like to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Larry McClellan. He is a retired professor at Government State University who will talk about those escaping their enslavement in the South and then traveling across Northwest Indiana on their way to freedom in Canada. He will explore the routes and locations in that region that were the networks of the Underground Railroad in the decades before the Civil War. This isn't his first forum. Some tonight have heard him speak about the Underground Railroad many times before, but we keep inviting him back. Um, After his presentation, we will have a question and answer session. The presentation this evening is being recorded. It will be available within a week on Ollie's website. Would everyone please be on mute? And nice to see you again, Larry.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be back with you all. And uh, some of you have heard some of my talking before. And am I, Michael, am I on the big screen for you guys?
You're on the
Yes.
big screen.
Okay, good, good. Because here, sometimes I can't tell. Well, I'm glad to be with you all. And uh, Michael and I were talking. I think I have now done this some kind of a presentation on the Underground Railroad. I think 6 or 7 years uh, for uh, Michael's project and program, and so I'm glad to be with you again. We are going to do a screen share, and I'm going to put a PowerPoint up and talk with you all. And at the very end, I want to tell a couple stories and we'll move it forward. So, Michael, let's see if we can successfully do a screen share. Uh, we are getting close.
There you go.
Oops. Okay.
Okay.
I am on your screens.
Yes.
Great. Okay. You'll notice some interesting conversations have happened recently, which has led me to look at connections specifically with Lake Michigan. And so, for those of you that have heard me before, some of the early stuff will be a bit familiar, but then I've got a
a set of stories, particularly looking at the connections with Lake Michigan, and of course, because of that, with Northwest Indiana. So delighted to be with you. And as we think about the Underground Railroad in Illinois and Indiana and the Midwest, there are really two great cycles of stories. There's a great cycle of stories about the freedom seekers, those people who had escaped their enslavement in the South. And there's a great cycle of stories about those who responded and created the networks of the Underground Railroad. And the great dilemma we have is that for most of the last 180 years, most of the conversation has been about the networks of the Underground Railroad and not as much as uh, really is necessary about the journeys of freedom seekers. And so, what I'm attempting to do in my work and other folks around the country are seeking to do is to really regain that balance so that we understand that the stories of the freedom seekers are as compelling as those of the Underground Railroad and the networks that supported them. And in doing that, we really need to reframe our whole conversation. Most of us grew up thinking about the Underground Railroad as something that happened on the East Coast with Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and things there. However, it now appears that a greater amount of activity happened in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois than ever happened on the East Coast. And we are just now beginning to get that story out. So we really need to reframe the way we're talking about all this. You'll notice that I've been talking about freedom seekers. And of course, we're talking about the people in the 19th century were identified as fugitive slaves. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was directed toward those people referred to as fugitive slaves. However, slave is a category of property. When I do my research, I in the 30s and 40s, 1830s and 40s, I'm not looking at population records. I'm looking at property records, estate sales and tax records. And there I find the horses and the cows and the sheep and the pigs and the slaves. Slave is a category of property. And all across the country, we are choosing to, rather than that, refer to people as freedom seekers to really affirm their fundamental human intention that these were people enslaved who did not want to be enslaved, and they were seeking their own freedom. And so we use the term freedom seekers, but of course we are talking about what traditionally were known as the fugitive slaves. A second major way to reframe the conversation is to understand that the freedom seekers were the protagonists. That's how all of this got started. We have an old history that says the Underground Railroad was created, some kind of system was created, and then slaves were brought up and carried through that system. And that's just not accurate. What happened was people seeking their freedom went in all kinds of directions. And as they moved into free territory, from time to time, they needed assistance. They might need directions or a place to sleep or some food. And they asked folks, and the people that responded to them became what we know as the networks of the Underground Railroad. And so rather than thinking of it as a system is set up and then people are brought through that system, that puts the energy with the abolitionists. And that's not accurate. What happened was that freedom seekers were heading toward their freedom. And as they did that, a network of response developed. Another part of the reframing that's really important is to see that there were diverse activists. Again, most of the Underground Railroad history in Illinois and in Indiana, almost all of it, was written by old white men about old white men. And in fact, the people involved in the Underground Railroad responding to freedom seekers was much more diverse. There were all kinds of black families and white families. There were men and women. We've got a number of remarkable stories about leadership being, in certain situations, being developed by women. And we need to really shift dramatically away from the romanticized tales, mostly about old white guys in the Underground Railroad. I've already pointed to the fact that we need to reframe the conversation in terms of um, seeing that it's across the Midwest, not just the East Coast. And very important, with freedom seekers, we're talking about their journeys. With the networks of the Underground Railroad, we're talking about locations. And the conversation needs to include both the journeys and the locations. Now, to begin with, we can never forget the brutal reality of slavery, people kidnapped and captured in Africa, the horrendous Middle Passage across the Atlantic, and people being treated as items to be sold. Um, it's very difficult for us to get our minds around this, but remember that there was this brutal reality, and that's what people were escaping from. The condition of slavery was just this incredibly brutal thing, and that they were moving away from that. Now, where did people go? People escaping their enslavement went in all kinds of directions to Mexico. They went into the West to live with indigenous peoples, into the Caribbean. Some people commandeered ships and took them up the Atlantic coast. The great majority came into the northern free states. And that my blue arrows suggest that. The other thing that's important about this map is to recognize the red states are the free states. The dark blacker states are the slave states. But please notice that Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were slave states. And when the Civil War begins, Abraham Lincoln is the president of a union of free and slave states. And part of the reason Lincoln's legacy and the Civil War stories are so complex is we need to remember that the Union was a union of free and slave states. And part of what Lincoln was continually negotiating was that unique phenomenon. And also with the map, notice that Illinois drops further south than any other free states, except California's over on the side. But Cairo and the southernmost counties of Illinois are further south than most of the state of Virginia. And so part of our unique Illinois story is that Southern Illinois was profoundly Southern. Now, my research suggests that at least 4,500 people escaping their enslavement came into Illinois, with 2,500 to 4,500 coming up here through the Chicago region, and most of them then traveling through Northwest Indiana. And there was a different pattern of movement coming up through the state of Indiana. And for those of you that live in Northwest Indiana, you need to recognize there is a very interesting dynamic that you all have to deal with, and that is that a lot of enslaved people escaping their enslavement came up through Illinois and then across into Northwest Indiana. Another large group of folks came directly up through the state of Indiana, and those two streams of movement combined in southern Michigan. But they really were two different streams. Now, these people were coming, many coming up the Mississippi River Valley. Probably the majority of people were escaping out of Missouri. A number coming up out of Kentucky and Tennessee, and again coming up through Illinois, and then coming up a different set of folks coming up through Indiana. My focus over the years has been on Illinois and Northwest Indiana. And as I've been looking at it, there are really two streams of movement. A significant number of folks, let's say, 1,500 to 2,500 folks coming into the Chicago region came to and through the city of Chicago. They came up out of the Illinois River Valley. But then there was a second stream of movement, the people that bypassed Chicago and came directly into Northwest Indiana. And then in Michigan, these two streams joined up on their way to Detroit and then freedom in Canada. My work has been particularly focused from the beginning on the Ton Farm, a unique situation where Dutch immigrants south of the little town of Chicago in the areas we know as South Holland and Roseland got established. And this is the painting of the farm of Jan and Angie Tunn. And the Tunns, along with the family called the Kuipers, were very involved. And so we had, across the Chicago region, lots of folks assisting freedom seekers to get to Chicago, a very rich collection of people in Chicago, both young white families and young black families. And some of you heard me talk about all that before. But my focus has been in large part on the Tunn Farm. We have tours here. This is on the Little Calumet River. It is a designated site on the National Park Service Network to Freedom. This was established about 26 years ago, and today there are over 700 places around the United States and in the Caribbean where places we know freedom seekers found assistance. And the Tunn Farm right here on the Little Calumet is one of those. We do a series of tours and other kind of educational activities. 2 years ago, we established a state historic marker there. And in that picture is the Illinois Lieutenant Governor, our Congresswoman, a couple other folks. The guy in the background with the sunglasses is the Consul General from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And the Dutch have been very, very intrigued by the fact that there were Dutch immigrants as part of this story. And again, this is a little part of the really big Chicago story, which I'm not going to be really visiting today. However, with our Dutch story, we were delighted this last spring that the ambassador to the United States from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the woman standing on the right, made a special trip to meet with us, and with the assistance of the Dutch government, we are installing some signs like this one, which will be half in English and half in Dutch. So there's a lot of activity, and I could talk for hours and hours about those folks that went to and through Chicago. We're working very closely now with people in Bronzeville to really be telling the Chicago stories. The second stream of movement bypassed Chicago and followed the Sauk Trail. The Sauk Trail was a historic Native American trail, and it reached from the Native American cities along the Mississippi River across to Detroit. And along this trail, Native groups interacted with each other for hundreds of years. And also that was the way that Native peoples connected with the French and the British and then the early American traders. And that bypassing Chicago route is a little bit different than the route that goes to and through Chicago. Just off of the Sauk Trail route is the Crete Congregational Church. This was organized in 1839, and this particular building was built in 1853. This is also a Network to Freedom recognized site. There are probably about 60 places in northeastern Illinois that need to be on the Network to Freedom because we know a great deal about them. The initial research I've done across Northwest Indiana suggests that we've found about 25 places where we think there's been some really good connection with the Underground Railroad and the journeys of freedom seekers. And there are probably 10 or a dozen of those that really the research is substantial enough that we should be putting those places on the Network to Freedom. Now, I've been doing all of this research with other folks about this movement. We know a great deal about how people came up through Illinois. We know how they came to and through Chicago, how they bypassed Chicago. And for years, we have talked about, in general, they went across Northwest Indiana and then into Michigan to get to Detroit, because in Detroit, they could get just across the river into freedom in Canada. But a couple of years ago, we began to look at some real serious questions. Where exactly did people go? As I've had contact with some folks in Indianapolis, they have tried to convince me that there was no Underground Railroad activity in Northwest Indiana. But that, I think, is an Indianapolis point of view. We can talk about that in other ways. Um, so I wanted to figure out, how did people get to Detroit and freedom in Canada? And I started by looking at the historic routes that they might have used. And think of these as corridors, not just as specific trails, but as corridors that people moved in and out. Of course, to begin with, we had the Sauk Trail. And then in 1825, the federal government built a military highway from Detroit to Chicago. And all across Michigan, it followed the Sauk Trail. But then in LaPorte, it left the Sauk Trail to go to the edge of Lake Michigan and around up to Chicago. Several years later, it was moved off of the lake and came down just kind of directly south out of Chicago and then over through Indiana. So I was looking at these trails. Here's the Michigan Territorial Road was built in the early 1830s, and there were a number of other roads that connected them. And of course, all of these were really designed to help people get from Detroit into the West, to Chicago and to the West. And interestingly, these same roads and corridors, as they're developed, become the corridors and the roads that are used by freedom seekers coming up out of their enslavement, getting to Chicago or getting into northern Indiana, and then following these trails or near these trails on their network, on their way to freedom in Detroit and then freedom in Canada. So looking at these, how do we connect the dots of all these Underground Railroad stories? And what we are proposing, and it's going to take us a long time to do this, we are proposing the development of the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail to eventually become designated as a National Historic Trail. Now, I've got really good information behind every one of these arrows as places where freedom seekers found assistance. These are the stops of the Underground Railroad. And what we're proposing is developing this National Historic Trail that would link together a number of these points to commemorate the journeys of freedom seekers and to commemorate the work, the networks of the Underground Railroad. It would have two routes, one starting in Chicago, the other starting in extremely southern Cook County, and they would meet up in LaPorte in northwest Indiana. Lots of stories to tell about all these. The main route, again, comes out of Bronzeville, starting at Quinn Chapel, and then over across into Hammond and Geary. The Sauk Trail route coming out of Park Forest and Crete and coming over the Iron, Cherville, and so on. And so what we've got, we have interesting places to explore, and I need your help on research. There was a thing called the Gibson Tavern that was now in what is now Gary. We've got some interesting information about. In the dunes, there's an intriguing shipwreck, and we've got stories related to Chrisman and Chesterton and Tremont. There are also traditions with the rail lines coming through northwestern Indiana. Michigan City, they're both railroad stories, and there are several families involved. There's an interesting controversy around the role of the family of Daniel and Mary Lowe, who lived south of Michigan City. And then down on the Sauk Trail route, there's some very interesting stories we really need to track down in Dyer with the State Line Hotel, the location of the home of Dr. Henry Palmer, the first physician in Lake County, and he was very involved with the Underground Railroad. You'll notice on this historic marker from the 1940s, it's still standing, from the 1940s, but it refers to his work on the Underground Railroad, aiding escaping slaves. In Valparaiso, there are some very rich possibilities for research. And to me, the most compelling place in Northwest Indiana for the Underground Railroad are stories related to Westville. There was a small but very strong Quaker community and a Union church, and there were families there that were deeply involved in breaking the law to assist freedom seekers. The two routes The one out of Chicago and the one out of Park Forest and Creek come together in LaPorte. There are some interesting families there. And the fascinating story of the Bank settlement, which was a settlement of free Black families that were kind of northeast of LaPorte. So there are lots of interesting stories to be exploring as we look at this route. Now, what I've been intrigued by recently is you'll notice over there on the far right, there's an arrow pointing into Lake Erie. And we have, of course, water stories related to the I&M Canal coming to Chicago. There are a variety of stories about people escaping on Lake Michigan, and there are also a variety of stories about people coming on the lake steamers the coastal steamers that went along the coast. And what I'm beginning to look at now are these stories specifically related to water. Now, freedom seeker stories are always journey stories. I could put another 60 or 70 lines on this map, each of which would represent the journey of individuals or families or small groups of people who were escaping their enslavement. And we've got just remarkable stories. And so I want to tell you a couple stories. And I want to check my time. I'm doing fine. Okay, I'd like to tell you some water-related stories that connect with both Lake Michigan and with Northwest Indiana. The first is the story of Henry Stevenson. This is a picture of Henry and some of his dear friends. This was taken in Windsor, Canada in 1895. And in 1850, Henry Stevenson started on a remarkable saga, traveling with some slave catchers. I'll get into the story, but they moved by horseback and steamboat and canal boat and lake boat, and he walked, and actually he also took the train. He had a remarkable journey out of central Missouri, coming up, following the Illinois River, coming to Chicago. He went on the coastal boat and then went over to, took a train across Michigan. Now, how did Henry do this? Well, Henry Stevenson was enslaved on a farm in central Missouri. And on the farm next to where he was enslaved, there was a enslaved couple. Their names were Anthony and Martha. Anthony and Martha escaped. They wanted to have a free life, and they took off. And their owner, the slave owner, hired a slave catcher by the name of Uriah Hinch. Great name for a slave catcher. And so the owner and the slave catcher were after Anthony and Martha. They came to the farm where Henry was, and they said, Henry's a very bright guy. Can we take him along and have him help us track down Anthony and Martha? And Henry's owner said, of course, he'd be glad to lend him for this task. And so, traveling by horseback, Henry, the enslaved people's owner, and the slave catcher Uriah Hinch all took off by horse across Missouri and into Illinois. And the deal was, every place they stopped, Henry would go and talk to the Black community, if there are any Black people around, and the two white guys would go and talk to the sheriff, and they had descriptions of Anthony and Martha and all that kind of stuff. And so every time they stopped, Henry went off, and they got to Peoria on the Illinois River, and they left their horses, and they got on the canal, the steamboat going up the Illinois River. And in Peoria, and at every major place they stopped, a routine developed. Henry would go and talk to the Black community, and the slave owner and Uriah Hinch would go and talk to the sheriff, etc. And in Peoria, Henry comes back to them, and Henry says, "You're not going to believe this, but I found evidence that Anthony and Martha were here, so we're on the right track, and they're going to Chicago." Now, needless to say, the slave catcher and Uriah, the slave owner and Uriah, were delighted to hear this information from Henry. So they go up and they stopped at some other river towns. They did the same thing. Henry goes and talks to the black community. They go and talk to the sheriff, etc. And Henry comes back and says, I heard it again. Anthony and Martha were right here. We're on the right track. They get up to Ottawa and they get on one of the canal boats on the I&M Canal. And Henry, who's fascinated by the workings of the canal, he's up on deck because he likes to see the canal boats going through the locks. And the canal boat is going through a set of locks, and there's some Irish workmen on the side of the canal, digging, fixing the canal. And they yelled at him and said, hey, you're in the North now. You're in Illinois. Do you want to be a free person? Run away. And Henry said, no, I can't do that. I'm working for my master. And of course, the slave owner and Uriah were downstairs and they heard this and they thought, my God, isn't Henry terrific? So they make it on the canal, I&M Canal. They get to Chicago. And Henry says, okay, I will go. There are a bunch of black people in Chicago. I'll go talk to them, and I bet we can find Anthony and Martha. So the owner and Uriah stay on the boat. Henry gets off the boat. There are some freight wagons going from the end of the canal going into the little town of Chicago. There's a black guy sitting on one of these freight wagons, and he motions Henry to get up, and he says, you want to go into Chicago? And Henry says, yeah. So Henry gets on this freight wagon, and the guy asks Henry, well, are you an enslaved person? And Henry says, well, yeah, I have been. He says, do you want to be free? And Henry says, of course I want to be free. And so the driver says, I can help you. So he takes him to the home of some black abolitionists who work with the Underground Railroad. And Henry meets them and he explains this saga that he's been through. And he says, can you help me? And they tell him, yes, we can get you on a coastal steamer. You can catch the train and get to Detroit. But we're short of money right now. We're not sure what to do. And Henry says, I can get some money. And so he goes back to the canal boat. He finds the slave owner and Uriah Hinch, the slave catcher. And he says, I think I know where Anthony and Martha are, but I need some money to get a hold of them. And of course, they're delighted. Henry has been this good and faithful slave. And so they give him some money. And of course, what does he do? He goes right back to Chicago. They buy him a ticket on a coastal steamer called the Sam Ward. It goes to New Buffalo. He gets off, gets on a train, goes to Detroit, goes across the river to freedom in Canada, and has a really good life and lives into his 90s in Windsor, Canada. Now, that's a remarkable story. This guy, if you can imagine, traveling probably close to 800, 1,000 miles, essentially taking a trip of deception so that he can make his way to freedom. Now, on Lake Michigan, there's Henry's travels on Lake Michigan. On Lake Michigan, there were other people that were using the lakes as a means to get to freedom. And we know that there were ships coming out of Chicago, going around to Detroit, and they regularly carried freedom seekers on their ships. And there are two prominent individuals who are involved with this process. Captain Augustus Walker was captain of the Great Western steamship, and Captain Chesley Blake, captain of the Illinois. And both of them sailed regularly from Chicago to Detroit, and both of them carried freedom seekers. And not only did they go to Detroit, but sometimes they also had occasions to stop on the Canada side as they were going. So we know that one time, Captain Walker had arranged to have an enslaved guy put down in the bottom, in the hold of his ship, and told him that he had to just stay there for the duration of the trip. And up in the regular living rooms of the passenger rooms of the steamship, there were a set of Southern families who were traveling. They had traveled up from New Orleans. They'd come up to Chicago, and now they were going around the lake to get to Detroit and then on to Buffalo and New York City. And the Captain Walker has this dilemma that he's got this freedom seeker down in the hold of the ship, and he's got these people up there. And what happens if they find out that this guy is in hiding in the ship? So Captain Walker sets up the scene. And one evening, they are over into Lake Huron. And one evening, one of the stewards comes up and whispers in the ear of Captain Walker. And Captain Walker looks astonished. And he says to the evening dinner guests, and of course, they were these Southerners, he says, "Oh my gosh, I have just discovered that we have a runaway slave in the hold of our ship. I am going to get rid of him. I will kick him off as soon as we reach land." And of course, the Southerners were delighted to hear that. What they didn't know was that the next day, the ship touched land on the Canada side. And Captain Walker made a great show of dragging this black guy out of the hold, bringing him up, and basically throwing him off the ship, kicking him into freedom. And it took the Southerners a while to kind of figure out what had happened. Another time, one of the captains had a family traveling on board their steamship, and it was a Southern family traveling with a young woman who was an enslaved person. And they happened to land in Canada to stop and stretch their legs. And we don't know if the captain had a role in this, but as they got off the ship, of course, their maid, this enslaved girl, got off the ship with them. And then they're standing on Canadian soil. And after the break, the family gets back up on the ship and says to this young woman, "Well, come on, we're going to leave." And she said, and somebody wrote down and said, she said, "Master, I've had enough of this life. I am in Canada and I'm going to be a free person." And they tried all kinds of things to get her to get back on the boat, and she wouldn't do it. And of course, absolutely, she stood her ground. And I believe that there are a number of great stories like this that we can be uncovering. Also, I think there may be some very intriguing stories related to the St. Joseph River in Michigan and Indiana. And there are also some very interesting stories to be uncovered about freedom seekers that may have traveled by boat up and stopped or gotten on the boat in Racine and Milwaukee. And if there are any of you out there that would like to work on Lake Michigan stories, please let me know. And now, before before I end, I would like to tell you one final story. It's the story of John and Eliza Little. And you'll notice on the map here, starting in western Tennessee, they came up through Illinois, went by ship around to Detroit, and then went on up into freedom in Canada. Now, I'd like to end by telling you that story. In the spring of 1841, John and Eliza Little were enslaved on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. And they had met, fallen in love. John had had a rough life. He had been enslaved in Virginia. His parents had been brought over from Africa. And John Little understood that, as he said, "I am the child of African princes." And he was a pretty tough character, and he carried scars on his back all of his life. So he comes from Virginia. For a while, he is he is enslaved in Kentucky, and then he ends up on this farm in Western Tennessee. He meets Eliza. They fall in love. They get married and realize if they're going to have any chance of a life, they have to escape. And so one spring night in 1841, John and Eliza get themselves together. They meet up. And part of what's intriguing in Western Tennessee is that the Tennessee River, which comes out of the Appalachian Mountains, comes into the top of Alabama and then goes straight north. It's one of the very few rivers in America that flows north rather than south. And so Eliza and John knew about this river. And so they made their way to the river and they followed the river up to the Ohio River. So in a way, they were going downriver up north, and it worked. Now, they get close to the Ohio River. Excuse me. They get close to the Ohio River, and there's a large swamp area. And years later, John remembered so clearly. We got to that swamp, and I found a floating log. And I put Eliza on that log. And we were carrying a few belongings, and I put those behind Eliza. And I pushed that log through the swamp. And I knew that if I misstepped, I would lose everything I loved. But John did not misstep. They made it to the Ohio River, and they borrowed a boat, got across the Ohio River, and they're on the north side of the Ohio River at the extreme southern edge of Illinois. They build a little campfire. They're exhausted from journeying through the swamp. And they're trying to catch their strength back. And some other freedom seekers happened to see their campfire. And they came and sat with them. And Eliza remembered years later that those other freedom seekers were really discouraged. And one of them said, well, we're just a few miles from Cairo. If we just go back to Cairo, we can, turn ourselves in, and maybe our masters won't be really tough on us if we turn ourselves back, and we ought to do that. And they were just trying to figure out what to do. And Eliza remembers that she stood up and she said, I know where we have been, and I know what I must do. And if needs be, I will walk barefoot to Chicago for my freedom. And John and Eliza Little walked from the Ohio River 370 miles to get to Chicago. They had contact with Black abolitionists who helped them get passage on one of the steamships around to Detroit. They made it to Detroit and then over to freedom in Canada, and they lived a very, very good and long life in Canada. But can you imagine? John and Eliza, a couple hundred miles getting to the Ohio River, 370 miles up Ohio, walking all the way up Illinois.
See if she needs water.
And so somebody is not muted. And so they do this remarkable thing. Henry Stevenson traveling, probably around 1,000 miles. John and Eliza, and we've got all kinds of stories like that. And some of those stories are Northwest Indiana stories. And I'm now finding that some of those stories I can talk about as Lake Michigan stories. And there's just a lot of really good stuff to put together. So I hope the stories have been helpful and interesting, and I'd be very open to your questions. Michael, how should we do that?
We should do that I'll start it, and others can follow me. And we actually discussed this a little bit before we started the program, but I was wondering how many folks you talk to that are doing similar work in states around us, and and yeah, pretty much just who do you run to that helps you or you help them?
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, uh, first of all, as any person that has done any significant historical digging knows, is that we always are building on the work of other people. And there have been a remarkable group of people in the last 150 years in Indiana and Illinois whose work I have built upon. And in the last 50 years, there have been some remarkable African American scholars that have been very, very hopeful. And so to begin with, there is the kind of the background research where you depend on a lot of people, and we're continually putting all of it together. And across the United States, there is a wonderful kind of network of folks that are investigating freedom seeker stories and the networks of the Underground Railroad. And I have worked closely with a number of them. The National Park Service Network to Freedom program for a number of years had a national conference. And the at that national conference, a lot of us could really connect with each other. But today, there are about 5 or 6 researchers who have been doing very, very extensive work in Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois that I really connect with regularly and depend upon. 2 very interesting kind of connections. Well, 3 interesting connections. One is there is a thing called the Underground Railroad Free Press, which is, if you will, a national newsletter for all of us. It has a circulation of about 16,000, and those are people all over the country that are working on this, and that's a way that we keep in touch with each other. A second kind of connecting point is that throughout 2024, the state legislature in Illinois created an Underground Railroad task force that was charged with figuring out how should Illinois be responding to the stories of freedom seekers in the Underground Railroad. And I was privileged to have been appointed to that commission, and we came out with a really good report. It's now before the state legislature, and we hope they are going to create the Illinois Freedom Trails Commission. Such a commission exists in Michigan, and such a commission was created in Indiana about 10, 12 years ago, but it has been inactive. This last October, some of the folks in Indianapolis got some people together, and they're trying to activate that. So what we've got here in the Midwest are some beginnings of state level agencies. The organization that I connect with used to be the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project. I'd shared with you some of our work on the Little Calumet River, but we have renamed ourselves the Midwest Underground Railroad Network, and that is because we are now in really good connections with people across Northwest Indiana, across the Chicago region, and we also have some connections in Iowa and Missouri and in Michigan. And so we're seeing ourselves as also trying to help, build those connections. And somebody, I think it was Richard. By the way, Richard, hi. I knew you. I recognize you. We are creating a brand new website, but existing materials can be found at 2 places, and I'm going to do a screen share just so people can pick this up. Okay, those are my books. Oops, I thought I had it. Oh, I didn't. Well, anyways, that's my email, mcclellan.larry@gmail.com. If you've got some questions, you get to me. Now, the organization I work with, our existing website will be taking down in a couple months, but the existing website would be worth looking at. It's the undergroundrailroadproject.org. So one word, undergroundrailroadproject.org. And the and the second website that you ought to look at is the one that I maintain, and that is one word, Illinois Underground Railroad.info, INFO. So it's undergroundrailroadproject.org and Illinois Underground Railroad.info. And you'll find loads of stuff. Other questions? Michael, any questions in the chat? Oh,
Yeah,
Durs?
Yeah, I have a question. How you doing?
Hi,
Um,
great.
I had a chance to visit the Historical Museum in Niles, Michigan, and I was really blown away by how much background and exhibitions they had on the African Americans. Have you had a chance to go there, or do you know much about Niles?
I've been in contact with some of the Niles folks, and but I've not been to the network. But my understanding is that they've got a really good base in that. Michigan has done a lot of very good work on their Underground Railroad research. We're currently connecting with a high school teacher in Niles who wants us to work with him to develop some curricular materials. And next week, next Wednesday, I'm going to be doing a program at the Michigan Maritime Museum, which is right there in South Haven, Michigan. And in addition to the folks in Niles, the people in South Haven are very interested in discovering and building on their African American history stories and their Underground Railroad stories. And so thank you for mentioning Niles. Yeah, that's a good place. And that will be one of the places that will have some ways of connecting with that as we create this National Historic Trail. There's a chat note from Richard about being in touch with, I think it's the Council of Civil War Roundtables. I've talked with several different, I think you're aware, I've talked with several different local roundtables. I'd be delighted to talk with the Congress. Maybe if you could send me an email, I'd love to be in touch with them. Other questions? Anything else in the chat, Michael?
Okay, I'm checking.
I got my hand up. Can I talk?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there you go. Terry, hi.
Hi, Terry.
Yeah, we had some conversations before about Hammond, and you were kind of thinking the trail went through 165th. And, there's some activity going over there. In fact, Dr. Schoen has been working with the folks in Hessville over there. And in the Briar East Woods is actually a dune ridge. So at some point, the lake went all the way to 169th, and the high point of the dune ridge in Briar East Woods would probably have been maybe where the part of that trail was. So I thought that might want to tie that into your research as far as what you're doing as far as the trail through Hammond there.
Right. Thank you for that. And I will be back in touch with Ken about the work that he's doing and that some of you are involved with. It appears that, after the glacial period, as what was called Lake Chicago, which was the Lake Chicago at one time was 60 feet higher than Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan kind of sits in the bowl left by Lake Chicago. There were a number of beaches formed, and what you're pointing to is one of those prominent beaches, and as makes a lot of sense. As Native American folks were traveling through the region, they traveled on those ridges, stay up out of the muck. And I think that as we do further research, we'll be able to refine which one of those ridges, those sand ridges, was actually used. There are um, what I've seen is that there are really three different ridges that might have been used at one point or another, and hopefully over time with Ken Schoon help and perhaps you and other folks as we're digging into this, we'll figure out exactly where those ancient trails were. We've got some pretty good ideas. I think a year and a half ago, I thought that coming across a 165 was the most logical, but I've now seen some evidence that around 169, I've also seen some evidence that would put it closer to Lake Michigan. So we're needing to figure out exactly where the trails crossed, and there were several different trails that went into Chicago, and so we need to also be aware of those alternatives. I believe from the literature I've seen and all the original documentation, I think there really was a main Detroit to Chicago road, but there were certainly very clear alternatives. Particularly, stagecoaches may have taken an alternative, and there's some other things. But it's the routes going across Northwest Indiana are they're intriguing, and I hope eventually we'll figure it all out.
Because Dr. Schoon, he identified the high point in Hessville on that dune ridge there.
Yeah.
And it makes sense too, because you got the dune ridge and you got the little Calumet River, and that would be right right in the middle of all that. So
yeah,
it
exactly.
probably
Yeah,
ties together somehow.
it really does, and I think Hessville was clearly some part of Hessville was clearly on that main road, and it has shifted a little bit as the railroads came in and all. A lot of those things shifted, but hopefully we'll get this nailed down in a year or two. Thanks for your help.
I have a question. This is Jeff. So aside from the Ton Farm on the Little Calumet, I know there's a marker on the Des Plaines River, I believe at Lake Street. To your knowledge, are there any other stops or significant sites along the rivers or waterways in the Chicago area?
Well, actually, there are a large number. My research has identified more than 60 sites across northeastern Illinois where we know that freedom seekers found substantial contact and assistance. And a number of those, understandably, were along waterways. The Mother Rudd Tavern up in near Gurnee is along a waterway. The I&M Canal headquarters building in Lockport. There were clearly sites in Wilmington, Shanahan, Joliet, Lockport, Lamont, and you get up into Cook County, uncovering some very interesting sites along what was the old I&M Canal and the old Des Plaines River. So obviously, rivers were often a very significant corridor. You follow the river, and we do have a number of those sites, probably a dozen or more that are directly linked to rivers and waterways. And by the way, that's all in my book.
Which book?
The book Onward to Chicago: Freedom Seekers and the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois. I did, to be immodest, if you'll forgive me, I did get a National Book Award through the Underground Railroad Free Press that I mentioned earlier. I've gotten the State Book Award, and the book has just gone into its second printing. So it's being well received. That has a lot of information, also has a number of maps that help you understand that Northeastern Illinois story. Now, I did not focus on that tonight because I really wanted to focus on Northwest Indiana and Lake Michigan for you all. But we know a great deal, not from my work, but also a lot of other people that I built upon about the activity in the Chicago region. Have we met?
No questions? I have to check the chat. Just for your information, but I'm sure you are aware of the Bonnie 09 house in Vandalia, Michigan, just east of Castle excellent preserved house and historic sites open to the public. Are you aware of that?
There in Michigan, there are a number of places like that, and Michigan has done a really good job of identifying those. Cassopolis and Cass County, in on the southern edge of Michigan, has a remarkably rich history because there have been free black families living there since the 1830s, and there have been free white families living there in the 1830s, and it's just a remarkably complex story, and lots of folks that were involved in assisting freedom seekers, both among the white Quakers and among these black farmers. And by the way, just to put a burr under your saddles a little bit, we now have, I think, more than 27 Network to Freedom sites in Illinois, and I'm working with people actively on another 5 or 6 sites in Illinois. Michigan has a number of Network to Freedom sites listed with the National Park Service. Northwest Indiana has no sites listed with the National Park Service, and there are places that need to be. So there is work to be done in Northwest Indiana.
They put in an infomercial into the chat line about Northwest Indiana Civil War Roundtable. We have a meeting on February 16th at the Crown Point Library. It's a free program. Chuck Robesco is a Gettysburg battlefield guide, will be speaking on the Gallant 14th. And we do have the Facebook page. So had to get that in there.
Terrific. Glad for the commercial. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. And as a matter of fact, before we go, Michael, let me, whoops.
Everything's okay.
Well,
Yeah.
I lost something. Let me go back for a quick share. These are my 2 of my books, To the River, the story of Caroline Quarles, who traveled through Northwest Indiana, and then the Underground Railroad south of Chicago has an entire chapter which kind of summarizes basically all we know so far about activity in Northwest Indiana. And then this is the book that I mentioned, that this was published in 2023 and is now going into a second printing. So, end of commercial.
Any further questions?
I'll send you some information, Larry, on the Congress of Civil War roundtables. They do have a website.
Great.
And I
I
can
would
put you in
appreciate
touch
that.
with Mike Movius.
Great. Okay. Great to be in. It'd be good to be in touch. Well, Michael, thank you to everybody. I hope it was intriguing for folks, and as always, glad to be with you.
Yes, thanks so much, and good luck. We just want to Valerie and I thanks everybody for attending, and thanks to you, Larry. Good to see you again, and we'll see you next year. Okay.
Well, hopefully before that. But
Oh,
anyways,
yes.
best wishes, and if you didn't get my email, you can always contact Michael, and he can get you back in touch with me if I can be helpful to anybody. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Bye bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye bye.
Turn off the recording.